It sounds like an episode of Suits.
Faking it till you make it sometimes can pay off.
It was pretty heartbreaking stuff, actually.
That sounds like a wild situation, just very dramatic.
So just don't do that. That would be my top tip.
Today on the File Notes podcast, we are talking to Nicola Tiffen, the leader of Duncan Cottrell's national immigration team. With a career that spans the United Kingdom and New Zealand, Nicola is regularly recognised in national and international lists for her expertise and high esteem as an immigration lawyer. With Nicola, we discuss becoming a partner, managing an immigration practice through COVID-19, and women in law. That's good.
So thank you so much for joining us, Nicola. We're super excited about recording this episode with you. So you were born and raised on a farm in Canterbury. What was it like growing up there?
Well, it's not something I think about a lot. The first farm we lived on was quite remote. It was up near the mountains near Oxford. My father drove the school bus as well as running the farm, and Mum was working on the farm. So I suppose my childhood was fairly, I only had a little brother who was obviously still a baby through a lot of that time, and so I had a lot of time, I guess, on my own. There weren't kids around to play with, and when I actually when I did start school, it's only 2 classrooms in the whole school. In fact, the school doesn't exist anymore. It was so small. So I suppose it was relatively idyllic, although I have quite strong memories of money being a real issue, and actually, we had to leave the farm because I don't think my parents could make the mortgage payments anymore. So then we moved to another farm where my father managed the farm for someone else, and we moved closer into the city, closer into the mighty metropolis that is Christchurch. And I ended up going to a bigger school and eventually ended up going into a school in town. And I remember it being a reasonable culture shock from growing up amongst farming kids to these sophisticated city kids who were aware of fashion and things like that, which I clearly wasn't to that point. Probably some would argue I still am not. But it was a really lovely childhood. It was really nice. And you had pets. I had a dog that followed me everywhere, and lambs, and it was quite good.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast. I can relate to you on the fact of going from a small town to moving to Christchurch even, and my Auckland friends laugh at me because they say that Christchurch isn't even a city or a big city, but for me it was like, wow, I live in a big city now.
I grew up in Christchurch, and that might be the first time anyone has ever said that people from Christchurch are sophisticated, so I thought that was quite funny.
And so being a farmer girl from a really rural part of New Zealand, going to being a partner at a large law firm, I don't think that would have been a very obvious path to everybody. What inspired you to pursue a career in law?
I suppose probably my mum. I remember my mother, and I've watched another one of your podcasts where somebody said, oh, people used to tell them they should be a lawyer, and I guess that was what happened to me. It's other people giving you that inspiration and that idea that ends up with you going into that part of life. And so I remember my mum saying, oh, you should be a lawyer, and it's probably because, like many other lawyers, people perceived me as being argumentative or obstreperous, stroppy. And I guess when I went to law school at Canterbury University, of course, it was I was very, very interested in how law came into being, and also how it actually, I suppose my main interest was how it actually played out in real life and practicality, in practical terms, really, because it's very different from when a law is written as to how it ends up being applied in real life and how people view it, and particularly in New Zealand, where there's a very, I guess the phrase is a number 8 wire mentality. You try and make things work for what you need to achieve. So New Zealanders' approach to the law is quite different from perhaps in other jurisdictions where people will try and, won't say get around it, but try and make it work for what they need to achieve a bit more than perhaps elsewhere.
And so, touching on that, in respect of other jurisdictions, once you graduated the University of Canterbury with a law and politics degree, your best friend convinced you to move to London.
That's
Could you
right.
tell us a bit about what that was like?
Well, as I said before, I'd never left the country before. I'd never, in my worldview was that Christchurch was, the big city. I hadn't even really. I think I'd been to Auckland once when I was a child to see some cousins. Like I'd never really been to a big city. So my best friend Jen Flavel, convinced me, and it was gosh, around 1999 2000, and it was pretty tough going to try and get a graduate job at that time in history. So she said, well, let's go to London. She was a teacher. She said, let's go to London and see if we can get ourselves a job. So we saved I had to move back home, which was an enormous sacrifice. And I was working in a clothing store, Posty Plus, saving all my pennies to try and get together the money that you needed to get your working holiday maker visa. And we used to joke that we'd make a big failure of it, and our big OE would be the big UB. We'd end up sleeping under bridges, and we were joking about it. But again, it was to hide anxiety about what might happen. But yes, it was, and I remember getting on the plane. It was back in the day. I mean, and this will blow people's minds, but back in those days there was just one screen at the end of the plane, and so you just had to watch whatever movie was showing, and people would get up and talk to each other around the plane and block your view of the movie. And so there wasn't much to distract you. And I remember sitting next to this lovely black pearl farmer from Tahiti or Rarotonga or somewhere like that, and crying the whole way. And in the end, he said, "Oh, for goodness sake," and got me a wine from the air stewardess so I could calm down. And I found it all quite traumatic going over to London. But once I got there, I loved it. So, yeah.
Did you have any first experiences of culture shock when you got there?
The entire thing was a culture shock. Yeah. So when I got there, I was always really interested in people with other languages and backgrounds, and because I guess growing up in Christchurch, it was all everybody was, I perceived everybody to be the same. I think my view on that has changed. But it was amazing seeing Hasidic Jews with their incredible, the hats and the way they have their hair, and people from all the African nations. I mean, I think almost every country in the world has got people in London. It seems to be, whatever you think of the Commonwealth, which there's pros and cons about the Commonwealth and its reason for being, but it's a marvel to have all these people together in one city, living together, having to interact. I just thought it was incredible. I thought it was amazing. And you could meet, and especially doing the work that I did as an immigration lawyer, I met people from backgrounds and places that I would never have got to meet if I hadn't made that decision about my career.
That would have been such a massive change from, someone growing up in Canterbury.
Very much so. And I remember, as you get to London, and all I wanted to do was sort of share what I was experiencing with my family. So I saved all this money for my mum and dad to come over, dad the farmer and his wife to come over. And I feel quite sorry for them now. They look back, because it would have been exhausting for them. It was, I flew them all the way, they flew all the way over from Christchurch. And then I was like, and you have to see this, and you have to go to Brick Lane, and, and then, and my poor mum and dad, it was just like, yeah. So it's a bit different when you're in your early 20s and you've got all that energy to run around.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have loved the experience of being able to come over and see what you were experiencing.
Yeah, I think they were pleased to get on the plane and go back home to their own beds as well. But yeah.
That must be a farmer thing. I think if I brought my parents over here, I think one of them in the first place refuses to go on a flight longer than 4 hours. So big city versus farm, it's quite a contrast.
Yeah, I can relate to the 4-hour flight thing. It is, I have worked with clients who their entire lives seem to be continually traveling, and I don't know how they do it. It's quite hard on the body and the mind. So,
And when you got to London, how did you go about finding your first job?
my first job wasn't even a law job. It was as I registered with a recruitment agency, and I ended up working for this in the clinic run by Professor Winston, which is basically an IVF clinic in London, and they put me in there doing admin work because they thought because I had a law degree I'd understand all the Latin medical terms, which actually I probably would have had a better idea than most. So I did that for a little while, um, and that was certainly really interesting. And then I um, kept sort of looking for jobs that would get me into the legal industry over there, and I found a job which lots of other people from the Antipodes were doing, which is working for the Insolvency Service, which was part of the Department of Trade and Investment over there. And the work I was doing was looking into companies that had become insolvent, and the insolvency practitioner had reported them to the Insolvency Service because they thought that there was some irregular dealings on the behalf of the directors, and we would investigate, look into whether that was correct, and if needs be, raise a prosecution to disqualify the directors from running companies again. In reality, what happened was it was almost the same case every time, which was with directors taking money out of the company instead of paying their employees PAYE or their wages in some cases. And disappointingly, you'd get phone calls from employees who are saying, well, how come I haven't been paid? And I've just seen my old boss driving down the road in a brand new Mercedes. It was pretty heartbreaking stuff, actually. But yeah, it was a really good introduction to the legal system over there. And, I got to see some of my cases go through at the Royal Courts of Justice on Fleet Street. And I interacted, and how in the UK they're still, they had the old system with barristers operating separately from solicitors. So it was certainly an interesting introduction to the instruction of barristers and the personalities involved with that. So that was my first job, and then I saw a job advertised for an immigration lawyer, and because I was a migrant and the media commentary about immigration was quite divisive. It still is. I thought I'd give it a go and apply, and worst comes to worst, at least it would be a good practice for a job interview back home. And yeah, I was lucky enough to get the job, and I have never stopped being an immigration lawyer since.
And during that time in London, there was a challenging atmosphere marked by a lot of anti-immigration remarks. Did this have any effect on your role as a lawyer?
Yes, and I mean there still is today a lot of anti-immigrant feeling, which I find it fascinating both in New Zealand and in England, considering both nations are largely built on immigrants, some going back hundreds of years and some going back only, well, you could say that, New Zealand's going back hundreds of years as well. I mean, every country has had waves of people come in and out. So, yeah, it definitely had an impact. And it's very political. And it's influenced not only by domestic perception of migration, but it's also influenced by international relations as well. So, I mean, I'm not practicing in London any longer, but the Ukrainian war would have had a marked impact on the practice of immigration law there. And I imagine that the Israeli-Hamas conflict has also had an impact. And depending on how one country is getting on with another country, your individual clients can be impacted. The additional security checks are undertaken if you're from a country that's, for example, if you're from Iran or Iraq or China, your applications can be delayed, and that it's very difficult for individuals to understand why they, as a law-abiding person who's never done anything wrong, should have their application take so much longer just because of international security concerns. So it impacts in every aspect of how you practice your relationships with your clients, what you can feasibly achieve for them, and also how you interact with other professionals and other people. Because I remember in London being in a black cab, and the black cabbie saying, "Oh, what sort of law do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm an immigration lawyer," and him saying, "Oh, well, we don't mind your sort coming over, it's the others we don't like." And it's really, and
Wow.
it sometimes takes you aback that people would have that view of the world and not understand that it's real people.
I imagine it will be an area of law where the way you interact with your clients uses a lot more emotional intelligence than other areas of law. That would be quite a difficult thing to be always thinking about on top of the actual legal matter at hand.
Yeah, I suppose I used to think that. I used to think, I suppose every lawyer does. My area of law is so much harder than everyone else's. But to be fair, I can imagine that if you're running a big commercial deal with some pretty, um, uh, with some people who are under immense pressure, there's a lot of emotional intelligence required to navigate that as well and deal with the personalities involved. But with my area of law, it impacts the whole family in a way that perhaps a commercial deal may not. And I know commercial deals can be make or break for somebody's livelihood or life, but I do feel that when somebody's made that, they're in another country and their whole future that they have planned for themselves and their family are dependent on a visa coming through, they certainly, they're certainly under a lot of pressure. And it's interesting how people react to that pressure. And, you know, some of my clients who I've helped over the years, they're just the loveliest people you could ever imagine. And I'm still, I end up becoming friends with some of them, which a lot of lawyers quite wisely don't, I suppose. But some of the people I have met, it's been an absolute privilege to have met them and to have helped them and see them come to this country and make a real difference to this country. So yeah, it's a nice positive area of law to be involved in.
Yeah, definitely. At that role, you uncovered a pretty serious scandal involving your first manager, I think. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so what was I? I think I was 24, 25, and it was my first job in a law firm in London. And I was an immigration lawyer, and the the person I was reporting to, it turned out that she'd been forging some work visas. And I discovered that. And um, and I still remember trying to persuade one of the partners what had happened. Standing there with a proper work visa document and this forged one, and showing him the difference. And I just was the longest half hour of my life, because you're thinking, well, this person is a senior lawyer, they must know more than me, maybe I'm missing something obvious here. And the senior lawyer thinking, well, she's just a junior lawyer, what would she, there'll be a reasonable explanation here, she's just worrying about nothing. And then the dawning realization that that's what had happened, and having to ring the Law Society and the insurers and dealing with the police. The hardest part of it was dealing with the clients who had been impacted and helping them to put things right as much as we could. There was obviously they had to go and get independent legal advice as to whether they wanted us to continue to help them or not. But yes, so it was. I had to take over the practice at that point, and it was a pretty steep learning curve, I can tell you.
Yeah, I bet there are a lot of challenges involved in kind of, I suppose, trying to resolve all of the issues that had been introduced and um, figuring out how to run that practice at the same time. What kind of consequences do you think that had on you and your career more broadly?
Well, I know in the short term I was a bit frazzled because I was working long hours to try and sort things out, and then I and a partner got on a train and travelled up to Sheffield in the north of England, which is where the immigration officers were based, cap in hand, to advocate for our clients and to ask them to help us regularize them and get them visas. There's one or two of them that I actually travelled abroad with and walked them back through the border to make sure they were going to be okay. So there was quite a stressful period there. And then, sort of in the longer term, there was an immigration law practitioners association over there. And even though none of this was my fault, I felt quite embarrassed about it all. So I think initially it impacted me in terms of I wasn't too confident about going up and introducing myself to other lawyers and things because I didn't really want them to say, "Oh my gosh, she's the lawyer at that firm where the person committed the fraud." And so I guess initially I was a little bit shy about um, uh, introducing myself to other lawyers. But longer term, I guess it had some real advantages in that I had seen the worst possible case scenario. So I I guess I was a bit less reticent in taking on some cases that perhaps I wouldn't have taken on otherwise because I knew that whatever happened, it would never be whatever I did. It would never be as bad as that. So I would at least improve the situation for the client, and I'd learned a lot in terms of liaising with the authorities and getting things achieved. The flow on from that is that I guess I was a bit more willing to try new things in my career and, move back to New Zealand and start again there as an immigration lawyer here or change law firms or hire somebody in that perhaps, I had a good feeling about but didn't tick all the right boxes, that sort of thing. So I guess it made me less risk averse long term.
Yeah, I can imagine, so many of the situations you would have been in at the time would have been very like risky and high stakes and very interesting. I mean, it sounds like an episode of Suits, to be honest. Like it could be.
Yeah, well, I suppose I there. I mean, most of the clients were. Oh, I mean, there was not much they could. They knew it wasn't my fault, and so most of the clients were remarkably calm and decent about it, and allowed us the opportunity to make it right and sort out their visas. And it was helpful that it was quite clear that neither the firm nor I had anything to do with it, and also the lawyer involved was prosecuted and convicted. Um, but I remember, as if you think about a Suits episode, I had this lovely Russian client, and we had to meet with him and explain his situation. And he was he wanted to speak to me alone. So the two partners that I had the meeting with left me alone with this Russian, this big burly Russian, and he he was like, "Now, Nicola, I trust you. I do not trust the others. I trust you. You and I are the same. We are the peasants. We do the work. You will sort this for me. I remember thinking, oh my God. He was a lovely, lovely man, but he was quite funny. But yeah, we got him sorted, by the way. He was fine.
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
That sounds like a wild situation, just very dramatic. So after your stint in London, you made the shift back to New Zealand. Like, what were some of the kind of most notable differences in the culture and, um, the types of like law, the cases you're involved in and the work that you're doing?
It was a bit of a shock coming from London back to Christchurch, so there was that social shock. I remember thinking before I came home that I'd been out of New Zealand for 10 years, so I assumed that everybody who's practicing law would have been upskilled in te reo. So I scampered off to the New Zealand High Commission to learn a bit of te reo, and I came back to Christchurch. No one was doing anything in te reo. So I thought, oh gosh, nothing has changed at all. In terms of cultural shock, um, I was working in a city law firm in London, so everything was fairly, I wouldn't say PC, but people were quite proper in how they interacted with each other. Um, and I was quite shocked. And not that people didn't interact properly, but it was a bit more rough and ready, I suppose. You'd have a lot more, um, there's a lot more color in the workplace, I suppose. And I remember thinking, goodness, this will never happen in London. Although saying that, there were some interesting interactions in London as well. But um, and the type of work was a lot, I was going to say smaller, but it was more, I was advising large global corporates and things in London, and when I came back home, I was helping a farmer recruit somebody to work in the milking shed. Um, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that's quite a change. So, but ultimately, the legal issues were fairly similar, and in some ways, it was a bit more rewarding to help. You have more of an intimate relationship with the client than you would in London, I suppose. So that was good.
Yeah, definitely. And I couldn't agree more from my limited experience, working with our customers in the UK and also in the US, the cultural differences around formality and professionalism are very different to what, are the norms in New Zealand and Australia as well, really, where people are so much more casual and you could say maybe a little bit more personal as well. And so that's a really interesting and a change that I did not expect.
No, I didn't really expect it either. I actually thought that Christchurch would be more formal than London, um,
Mm,
but it's definitely not. And it's got its real advantages. You can form a,
mm.
a better connection with your colleagues and your clients, but at times it's also a bit challenging. Um,
Yeah, I think at times probably it can lend itself to being a little bit more honest and straightforward than kind of when you have to navigate what is the appropriate thing to say in this moment, what is the appropriate way to say it. I grew up in Christchurch and lived there up until June this year. In the past 12 years, the city's experienced some real disasters. Around 2010, series of major earthquakes pretty much destroyed the city. Where were you when the earthquakes hit?
I was on the 15th floor of the PricewaterhouseCoopers building when the big earthquake happened on February 22nd. So it wasn't a good day. And we had to go down 15 flights of stairs in the dark, single file, with all the people from the building leaving. And then we got out of the building, and all the water had risen out of the ground, so you had to wade the water. And I remember some of my female colleagues saying, "Oh, I think I'll take my shoes off. I don't want to ruin my shoes." And I was thinking, I think I'm going to keep my shoes on. I don't know what's in this water. So we were just adjacent to the PGG Wrightson building, which collapsed, and it was just, we were all in so much shock. It's difficult to remember it all quite clearly, but there was that horrible walk home, hoping that your house was still standing because you were walking past houses that weren't. And I remember walking my PA at the time, who's still very good friends with her. Her mum was working in a supermarket, so we walked her to the supermarket on the way home, and watching them reunite after, both of them were frantic with worry about each other. But it also reminded me, I was in London when the bombs went off in the London Underground, so it was actually a reasonably similar feeling. Everybody was just wandering around in a bit of a daze.
It's interesting, like the effect of those like sudden, unexpected, shocking experiences have on people. For me, I was at high school at the time, and of course there'd been the September earthquake the year before, and so as a result of that earthquake, we had students. We were sharing the campus of our high school, and so I would start high school early and finish early, and so by the time the February earthquake struck, I had just sat down on my bed at home, and um, I suppose, out of luck more than anything else, I was completely, my house was more or less fine, couple of cracks, and I'm not sure if it got red zoned or not, or I can't remember what it was, but for a kid, I suppose I just, isolated away from the city, which was at the hardest, in the eastern suburbs. It didn't really seem like so much, but definitely the shock and surprise was pretty incredible. More recently, Christchurch has been pretty unlucky, and more recently, 49 people were killed in the worst terrorist attack in New Zealand history. And of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. How did these kind of disasters affect your work? Working in immigration, I imagine it was pretty significant.
Yeah, all three of them. So the earthquakes, the pandemic, and the terror attacks have had significant impacts on my work and my career. So with the earthquakes, the initial, we couldn't get into our offices, and we had clients' passports in there, and also Immigration New Zealand in the central city had our clients' passports, and they couldn't get in there either. And a lot of clients, of course, wanted their passports and they wanted to get out of New Zealand. So the initial days were trying to get their passports back and recreate files and deal with trying to move things forward for them. Then that transformed into trying to bring a lot of people into New Zealand to participate in the rebuild, and thank goodness they came. Honestly, it's rebuild Christchurch. It was just very generous of these people, if you think about it, to give up their homes and come to New Zealand, where they knew they were coming to a disaster zone to rebuild. So we helped a lot of them come in, and a lot of them were single young men. So some of them got themselves into a little bit of spot of trouble every now and then. So it was certainly a lot of work. And then with the terror attack, uh, I I was lucky enough to be appointed on a panel of lawyers by the government that was approved to provide advice to families or victims impacted. And I did help a number of families with either bringing extra family into New Zealand to support them through the process, or helping the actual victims get their residence and move on with their lives. So that was an absolute privilege. There's one particular family that I met, and they'd been through actually they'd been through the worst possible outcome, really, and they were still thought of others and were still generous and kind. Um, and they were trying to navigate all of this in a country where they knew very little people, and the legal system was unfamiliar to them, and the language wasn't their preferred language to deal with difficult situations in. So they were quite remarkable people to interact with. The pandemic, when the borders closed, that was a pretty bad moment to be an immigration lawyer. Selfishly, from a career perspective, I thought, oh my god, that's a 20-year career gone, because it wasn't really made clear that it was only a temporary situation. But also, I spent the first 2 weeks just talking to clients on the phone. I didn't have anything to tell them because there wasn't much information available from the government really as to what was going to happen with the border, and we had people who got halfway around the world and we had to send them back, and it was very stressful. And then, of course, they started to ease the border open a little bit, and if some people could come on these critical purpose visitor visas, and the rules on those changed constantly, and it was and there were businesses, and also our health service desperately needed people to come in to the country. So trying to get people organised as quickly as possible and get them in, sometimes within a 3-month time frame, particularly for the health service professionals, was very challenging. And keeping families united, it's always been my advice to clients that one shouldn't go ahead of the rest of the family, should all travel together. And I think the pandemic highlighted that, because there were lots of cases where the main breadwinner came ahead to New Zealand and left the partner and the children behind while they sorted things out, and some of those families ended up being separated for 2 or 3 years. So getting families reunited was a big priority for us, to get mum and dad and all the kids together again. So there was one
Wow.
client, he'd never even met his child. His wife was pregnant when he left, so she couldn't fly. She was that, and the baby was born in the middle of the pandemic in a country that wasn't managing it as well as others. And he was desperately worried about her. And then we eventually got her and Bubs over to New Zealand, but he hadn't seen them for a long time. So he was working all day, and then in the evenings he was on Zoom or Teams trying to see his little boy and get to know his little boy. So, yeah.
Wow, that must have been so scary. I didn't even know that like those kinds of situations were happening during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people did. And there was a general sense that, quite rightly, that the border should be closed, but I don't think that the sacrifices that people made to achieve that was always that well publicized, because there were families who came here, people who came here who were doing very important jobs, such as doctors, people who were maintaining our IT infrastructure, people who were managing logistics in this country to get things from A to B, who were without their families and were working incredible hours with no support. Oh, and one group of people that really suffered, in my personal view, is the people who are working in the care homes and the care industries. They were often separated from their families and their husbands, and wives, um, and they were wearing full PPE gear all day long. They were really dealing with the disease full on where they were, and
Mm.
they got very little thanks for it. And when it came to trying to reunite their families, it was often quite difficult. So, and I don't think many New Zealanders would have understood about that.
Yeah, definitely. So, can you share some examples of practical steps or habits that helped you adapt and move forward, when you were facing these challenges, whether or not it was the scandal in London or disasters that hit Christchurch? What are some of the personal practices that helped you get through those times?
Um, that's a very good question. Keep going. Just often it's really, I think, tempting to take, just keep going. It's tempting to say maybe I can't do this, or I need a day out, or something like that. But um, you've just got to keep going and believe that you can manage it, you can get through it. Um, the other thing, of course, is to take care of yourself. So um, sleep is so important. When I was a younger lawyer in London, I know I really struggled with sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night worrying, often completely needlessly, worrying that I hadn't signed off a particular document, and I'd go into the office the next morning and I had. Um, so learning to try and switch off at least and get yourself a proper sleep, because if you've had a good night's sleep, then you can pretty much manage anything you can the next day. Um, and this is one I'm not overly good at, but is talking to people about the situations that you're trying to manage, like talking to a colleague. There was there's a partner in London, Steve Lauber, who I worked with during the time with the forged work visas, and he wasn't an immigration lawyer; he was an employment lawyer. Um, but having somebody to go in and sit down and say, look, I've got this, this is what I'm thinking about doing, you know, debating the various routes and options that you can take for a client, especially if you're practicing in an area of law um, that there's not a lot of other people doing that area of law. The immigration law, there's not thousands of us, for good reason. It's not one that you make a fortune out of doing, I can tell you. But it's good if you just keep going, keep the faith, to make sure you get enough sleep and look after yourself, and 3, you take the time just to go and talk about what you're proposing to do with a colleague, just so you can be confident that you've considered every angle, and B, it just really helps with your thinking and processing and analytical take on it, really.
Yeah, and probably a little bit of venting in there as well sometimes.
Yeah, well, sometimes, although you don't always have the time to do that, the venting often comes months afterwards, where you sit down with a glass of wine and think, goodness, actually, that was yeah, at the time you're just trying to, sometimes with immigration, especially if there's a big event like a pandemic, it's coming so thick and fast that you just got to keep going.
So, transitioning to a bit of a different topic, your journey to becoming a partner, can you outline what that process looked like for you?
Um, well, I remember that there's times in my career where I thought, I'm never going to make partner. I don't bill enough, or my area of law isn't considered to be valuable enough for a firm, or um, I'm not saying the right thing. I don't know. I always used to think I'll never get there, and there's something I'm not doing right, and if I only could work it out what it is. Um, it, in terms of my journey, now that I look back on it, I there was no doubt that I would have I was always going to get there. I just needed to keep doing what I did and doing my best, and it would have all been fine. And so I guess I was probably plagued with self-doubt, which was so if people are thinking, one piece of advice I'd say, if you're worrying that you'll never make it, and that the whole world's stacked against you, it's not. You'll get there, and law firms really, really want you to become a partner and contribute and help, because it is a very communal thing being in a law firm, and they just want to make sure. And a lot of the time with partnership, and I don't really appreciate this at the time, is that we want to make sure that you're going to, when you become a partner, it's going to be a good experience. You're not going to become a partner and feel ridiculously stressed and out of your depth. You have to be at that point where you're confident about what you can do and running your own practice.
What do you think was really important for you in becoming a partner? Like, what are the kinds of um, steps that you took, or that, in parts of your career that you think were really critical?
Well, building a practice and having a client base was obviously key. Um, Working on my own, developing my knowledge, and you can't develop your knowledge overnight or even within, or I suppose some year maybe you can, but I'm not a genius, so it took me a few years to learn as much, and I'm continually learning. I'll never know everything there is to know about immigration law, and clients will continue to surprise me with the questions that they come to ask me. So I think part of it is acknowledging that you'll never know everything, but learning how to, and I suppose that's actually how it worked for me, is that because of my early experiences, I have that willingness to just keep going and think, okay, well, we can work out how to manage this situation. There's a solution. So yeah, I guess it's like in Suits when they say when there's a gun pointed at your head, there's still 100 options or whatever it is. I can't remember the phrase they use, but there's always something you can do to help the client. Almost always.
Yeah, definitely. Partnership is generally thought of as this kind of high status role, that's hard to achieve. And, oftentimes, people talk about having to make personal sacrifices on their journey. Um, what kind of personal sacrifices did you have to make to get to where you are today?
And I don't know if it's to make partner, but it's to provide the services that I have to my clients. I've I've missed out on family events, and um, I've not been as present as I could have been with some of my friendships and things like that. Um, so that because you work, especially with immigration law, you're doing phone calls at 11 o'clock at night or in the wee hours of the morning. You two will relate to that. Um, so that means you can't go to your friend's 40th and have a big night because you got a phone call early the next morning because it's Saturday morning, but it's really Friday evening in the rest of the world, sort of thing. So, but lots of professions have that problem. But you're in this privileged position to help a client. But it did mean that I missed out on being with people sometimes when I wish I had been there. That's the main personal sacrifice, I suppose. Yeah, and I suppose because immigration laws can become quite all-consuming. There's other areas of law that I had a real curiosity about, like trust law and things like that, which I wish I'd had the chance to learn about. No, and again, it's because it would be nice to be able to explain it more to my clients. I have to get another lawyer in to tell them about trust law, which is good. I shouldn't be dabbling anyway, but I wish I knew a bit more about it. So
Yeah, I can really relate to that. There's so many things that I would love to learn about or spend more time on, but kind of sometimes you just have to really focus and obsess over the thing that that works best for you, I suppose. Earlier, you touched on probably something that a lot of professionals face, myself included, imposter syndrome, and kind of, thinking, oh, there's this one thing that I'm missing to become a partner, or, um, and so, what tips do you have? What are some of those kind of helpful things that worked for you, and kind of maybe not overcoming imposter syndrome, but dealing with it and quietening it, for lack of a better word.
Oh, I wish I had the answer to that. I suppose, one thing is that actually having some self-reflection and not thinking that you are all of that probably also has its advantages, because people are more likely to trust you and value what you say, because you're not talking through a hole in your hat all the time. When you say something, it's, you've given it some thought and you feel that it's important to say. So I would say, because you can beat yourself up for having imposter syndrome. So just don't do that. That would be my top tip. And feel the fear and do it anyway. Just keep going, because even though um, you might think that you're not doing the best job you possibly can, the chances are there's no one else out there who's got the time or energy or the motivation to do it as well as you do it for your client, because you worry about whether you're doing a good enough job. So,
Yeah, you touch on this a lot around this, keep going, this level of persistence that is so valuable. And I've often um, heard great entrepreneurs and other people talk about how important persistence is, and I think and entrepreneurship, but I think of course in so many other areas of life as well. I think Steve Jobs said maybe in his Stanford commencement address, he said that 50% of the difference between whether or not a new company succeeds or fails is down to the pure perseverance and determination of the people starting it out. And so, yeah, that really resonates with me, and I think it also relates to kind of this necessity of resilience in the face of like challenges, and being able to just like take a punch to the face and put one foot in front of the other.
yeah, although saying that, and it's right, as you was talking, I was thinking about the people of Christchurch with the earthquakes, and we keep having the aftershocks, and people talked about the word resilience a lot. And I don't know if you remember, Luke, but people got a bit annoyed about being told they're amazingly resilient all the time. I think people wanted a break. So and I'm not overly good at this, but I suspect that actually taking a moment to think, actually, that was a job well done, I did okay there, it's probably a good, even if it's going outside and having a walk and having a think about how something's gone, and rather than focusing on, oh gosh, I wish I'd done that a bit earlier, or I wish I thought of that idea a bit sooner, or I wish, um, thinking about the end result that you achieved, and not congratulating yourself, but at least reflecting on the fact that you've done something good to help someone, and because that's what the law is about ultimately. It's helping your clients.
Yeah, and acknowledging those wins is really important.
Yeah, because often it's the clients who will come back to me anyway and say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And I'm busy thinking, oh well, I know we got there, but I wonder if I could have got you there faster, or I I'm always, so it's sometimes, and you can't rely on other people to do that. I think you've got to do it yourself.
Following on that theme of a lack of confidence and sometimes imposter syndrome, I've spoke to so many clerks at law firms, and something that's really apparent to me is that all the women I speak to are so much less confident in the way they talk about their work and the confidence they have in their ability compared to males who are in the same position as them and doing the same kind of work. Do you have any
Yeah.
advice for people in this position?
Uh, yeah, well, I think my first piece of advice is not to beat yourself up about it, because unfortunately that seems to be the way society is structured. Boys are raised to break things and be rough, and it's okay, and girls are raised to be worried and careful about things and make things look pretty or whatever. Um, I know that's not a rule, but it's a general sort of summation. So when by the time you get to adulthood, I guess guys tend to be like, well, it doesn't matter, I'm confident about if I break something, I can fix it. Whereas with the female mindset, it's like, oh gosh, I better not break that glass ceiling, for example. And you're trained not to be stroppy or outspoken and things like that. So I think don't beat yourself up about it because it's not your fault. And just do the best you can and try and remember that people aren't silly. They can see. They can see who's doing a good job. Partners can see who's doing a good job and who's not. The only thing I would say is that if you are too quiet, it's easy for a partner to think, oh well, that person's really busy because I haven't heard from them. So, and you could miss out on work. So, if you're not somebody who's going to keep knocking on the partner's door and saying, I haven't got anything to do, I really want some work, send them an email and say, I've got capacity. So that willingness to help will stand you in a lot better stead than standing around the water cooler bragging about how awesome you are.
Yeah, and I guess faking it till you make it sometimes can pay off, even if at the time it's scary.
Yeah, well, be honest about it. So, and you won't know everything, even for the first 5 years of your career. I remember when I was in London, somebody said to me, "Oh, the worst part of your legal career is around your second, third, or fourth year, where at the beginning you think that you can handle everything, and then about the second or third year, you start to realize how little you actually know and how much more experience you really need." And I actually think that's right. I remember seeing quite a lot of lawyers dropping away at that point and thinking, "Oh gosh, it's quite hard. I don't know if I've," and of course they do. Of course they can do it. I mean, it's just keeping going, not giving up.
And on the note of dropping away, there's more women currently studying law, and there's more women than ever before in roles such as senior associate. But these numbers don't align at partner level. Do you think that it's just a matter of time before these numbers catch up, or do you think there's still issues in the legal industry that are meaning that women aren't progressing to partner?
When I graduated from law school, there were more women graduating from law school, and there were more women.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not changed in 20 years, and I thought, as a matter of time, it would change. And I remember one day looking around and thinking, hang on, where are all the women that I started practicing law with who are much smarter than me? I can tell you, they've all dropped away, and I'm just standing here on my own. If they all gone off to some place better, and I'm the one left behind, did I not get the memo? I don't think it's necessarily a problem with the legal profession. Suspect it's just a way that our society is managing itself and structured, that women end up taking on the majority of the work and the mental workload at home, not just the physical workload of the washing and the cooking or whatever. They're also the ones who are managing the household and deciding who will be where and what needs to be done and where we're going on holiday and what Christmas presents X, Y, and Z are getting. And so I think for a lot of women, it becomes exhausting because they're doing a 60, 70-hour week in a law practice and then coming home and managing a household as well. And you can only do that for a certain length of time, whereas with a lot of men who become partners, they're not doing that. They've got somebody at home full time making sure everything's operating smoothly on that front. So all they have to do is get up in the morning, come into the office, and then occasionally pick the kids up from school or something like that. I mean, that's probably a sweeping generalization, but I suspect there's a little bit of truth to that. So, and you do see women coming back into the profession later, but but their priorities are often their children and their families, so they don't want to be going off to partners retreats for entire weekends, or staying, having to go out for late night dinners and things. They want to get home to their families. Saying all of that, I think the change that I am seeing is that a lot of men feel the same way, and they want to be with their kids, and they don't want to go away for whole weekends. And I wonder if the change will happen. Well, I think it has to happen from that point of view. I think a lot of chaps are going to say, well, hang on, I'd really like to be organising the Christmas presents this year, or deciding whether we're going to have um, turkey or ham on Christmas Day, and I want to be the one who's taking the kids to school every morning and making sure they've got a nutritious lunch. Because if we had children, I'm sure Daniel, my husband, would much prefer that he decided what the children were eating, because if it was up to me, they'd probably just have cheese and crackers every day. But yeah, so um, yeah, I think it's a wider change that needs to happen rather than just in law firms.
Yeah, I think there is this change in society where paternity leave is accepted, or a lot more than it used to be. Um, and definitely I think there's a desire from men to kind of be more involved in all of those areas of life.
Yeah, because they're missing out. They're missing out.
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine feeling pretty jealous, to be honest. Not that I have kids.
Yeah, well, I'm assuming there is moments where you're not jealous, but yeah, it's like any job in life. I guess it's good parts and bad parts. So you have to do both to, yeah.
I'm still really shocked that when I brought up the fact that there's more women studying and graduating law now, that it was the same as 20 years ago, because I think this is a statistic that gets drilled around everywhere at law school and online as if it's a new thing, and all of a sudden women are studying law. And the fact that it has actually always been like that, it kind of says something in itself that they're still going on about this one statistic.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I'm in my late 40s, so I I might be skewed in my view, but I actually think it's harder for women now than it was when I graduated, because when I graduated, you bought a suit and you wore that to work pretty much every day with a different shirt, just like the blokes do. And nowadays, I see the women come into work and they have these amazingly beautiful outfits and they look great. But I think, God, and they've got hair straighteners, which we didn't have back in the day. You just had to put it up in a ponytail and get in there. Um, and I think, gosh, I mean, I would never have had the time to get up the extra hour earlier in the morning to work out what I was going to wear, and I was too tired. So I wonder sometimes whether there's because of Instagram and image, a lot more focus on image these days than there was back. Although, again, maybe I missed the memo. Maybe people thought I was shockingly shambolic in my appearance, but um, I, I do feel like it might be sometimes a bit harder for female lawyers than it is perhaps for their equivalent males, because the guys are still doing the trousers and shirt and quick shower in the morning and then they come. So yeah.
On to our quick fire round, Nicola. So basically, I'm going to shoot a bunch of questions your way, and I want you to come back to me with the first thing that comes to mind. If you could give any piece of advice to someone who's in a similar position as you were at the start of your career, or perhaps just graduating, what would it be?
Just do it. Just go ahead and do what you want to do and follow your dream, and just don't doubt yourself.
And what single thing would you change about the law?
I would might try to make it more accessible, so it's easier for people to get the advice that they need, because a lot of the problems I see is because people have been fearful of what it's going to cost them to speak to a lawyer earlier.
Yeah. And finally, if you weren't a lawyer, what would your dream job be?
Oh gosh. I think I'm not smart enough, but I would have loved to have been a doctor. My brother's a doctor. I would have loved to have been a doctor.
I'm sure you would have made it a great one. So thanks so much for joining us, Nicola. It's been great talking to you.
It's lovely talking to you too.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of File Notes. To keep up with the latest episodes and content, follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube at File Notes Podcast. You can also visit us on our website at vxt.co.nz/podcast/file notes to subscribe to our email list and never miss an episode. That's vxt.co.nz/podcasts/file notes. See you there.